What we are interested in is understanding where people come from so that we can actually even appreciate those who are different from us and appreciate where they're coming from, even if it doesn't seem to work for us.
I don't need this up in my space.
That's a good sock with a good shoe. Let's move on.
What's going on? Tell us. Talk to me.
Well,
I think Daryl's blowing his nose.
Daryl, good one.
A fact is something which, based upon some sort of a standard of measurement, is understood to be, observably the case, and usually involves some form of data that, being based upon the agreed upon standard, is indisputably the fact that we arrive at based upon whatever that standard is that we've accepted. When we realize that pure water, when it's boiling at a barometric pressure of, say, a billion millipascals, that if it's pure water, it boils at 100 degrees Celsius, and we can argue about that, I suppose, but that's apparently a fact. So I would see a fact as something that seems to be indisputably the case, based upon some method of measure.
I would disagree with that. I think that the word fact gets used, broadly speaking, in two senses. There are, of course, different kinds of facts. We speak of mathematical facts versus empirical facts versus axiological or value facts. Subjective facts about like pains and itches and tickles that aren't accessible to other people directly, and then socially constructed facts, like if I say that so and so is married or so and so is the president, that's a socially constructed fact that results from consensus. And then there are things like scientific facts, which presumably are independent of any mind and aren't socially constructed, even though they might be socially discovered. But broadly speaking, I think that when we talk about facts, we use that word in two ways. We use it to describe what you described, which is often qualified as a demonstrable fact or an established fact or an agreed upon fact, if you're a conventionalist. But we also use the word fact in a less restrictive sense, in a less qualified sense, to mean that which is the case, whatever the case is, known or unknown. And so I think when people are, when philosophers who are moral realists are talking about moral facts and are claiming that there are moral facts, they're not saying that these facts are necessarily established or demonstrable. They might be demonstrable, but they're not demonstrated necessarily, although some would contend that some have been demonstrated. But they're arguing that there is a domain of facticity about what ought to be. So normally when we're speaking of empirical facts, we mean that which is the case, whatever the case is. And in the domain of morality, when we speak of moral facts, we mean whatever it is that ought to be the case, because morality presumably is about what ought and ought not to be. It's not about what is, right? It's not about corresponding to some existing state of affairs. It's about describing a way that sentient beings ought to conduct themselves. So obviously it can't be a demonstrable fact because there isn't a direct correspondence between an existing state of affairs and the moral proposition. A moral proposition is always a proposition about how things ought to be, not in fact how things are, which is why we end up with the so-called is-ought problem and questions of the naturalistic fallacy and so forth. So in the domain of morality, when we're speaking of moral facts, we're not talking about I would contend we're not talking about demonstrable or established facts. I think that's the wrong conception of facticity to be used there. That would be my view.
Would you at least agree that if you're talking about those different kinds of facts, you can't really give them the same properties or use them as if they possess all the same force and usefulness that a different fact? And by the way, the social fact of being married, it is a legal contract. So perhaps the two people are in love or something like that might be more
right.
Social fact. But my concern is that when I see people talk that way, I think they start using the word fact in that way. And if we're going to use the word fact in that way and just kind of define it, then we can define it that way. But I don't see how we can then use the word fact in a manner that resembles the way we use the demonstrable fact. I mean, you can allege that it's a fact. You're really just alleging it's the case. It's no more than I don't see what the difference is between that and a belief.
Well,
other than that, you just might be right, but how do we know?
Yeah, well, I would challenge that use of the word belief. I think that's a deflationary use of the word belief to mean a mere opinion that is unsubstantiated or unwarranted. Whereas I think a well-supported, well-justified, well-corroborated, and demonstrably true belief is still a belief, right? A belief is just what you think is the case, right? And you can think something is the case for all the best reasons, or just terrible reasons, or no reasons at all. So
it would be on the strong side of belief, the real strong side of belief.
Yeah, exactly. When a person is claiming that something is a moral fact, there is the danger that there's going to be an equivocation, that a person is going to import all of the same assumptions and intuitions that they would bring to bear when talking about empirical facts in the moral domain. And clearly, a moral fact is a claim about what ought to be, not what is. And so you can't just that's why you can't just point to some existing state of affairs and say, there, that settles it. These are the moral facts, right? They're not demonstrable in that way. If you're going to demonstrate that something is a moral fact, there has to be a different kind of procedure. And I think that there are procedures on offer that people can put forth, but they're not going to be like a scientific demonstration, even though the things that go into making something a moral fact, if you believe in moral facts, if you're a moral realist, will supervene on states of affairs, will include and rest upon, be constituted out of states of affairs in the world. So I'll just give you a trivial example of what I mean by that. I mean, if I were to say that walking up to you, Bob, and sticking a pencil in your guts, that would be wrong. Okay, if I say that, presumably there are facts in the world, actual facts in the world, ordinary facts, not moral facts, that make it the case that it's morally wrong to stab you in the guts with a pencil. For instance, the fact that it would wound you, that it would hurt terribly, whereas if you were like Wolverine, the superhero Wolverine, and you would heal instantly, and that it might even cause you no pain. Let's imagine further that it would cause you no pain. Let's imagine further that it would kind of tickle, and it would be kind of pleasant to you to be stuck in the guts with a pencil. So it would cause no harm and no discomfort, and it might even be agreeable. Suddenly, it would cease to be the case that sticking a pencil in your guts would be wrong. It might even become a kind of courtesy. It might become of greeting. So there are facts in the world that would bear on whether something is a moral fact, but they're not entirely constituted out of those.
That strikes me as being a convenient runaround. That strikes me as being a bit frivolous. It's a convenient workaround. I mean, because I would think that we could certainly determine that it's a fact that being pushed in the gut by a pencil would definitely wound me. We can definitely show that it's a fact that I would not be happy with it, and we can even talk about the fact that there appears to be extremely common ways that people respond to this. But as you even pointed out with Wolverine, the actual facts here are the biological facts and the sociological facts, and there's a sense in which the so-called moral fact is really a well-reasoned out corollary in a sense.
Well, the argument is not that those empirical facts, like that you would be hurt, that it would harm you, that it would inflict pain, that it would be undesirable, that it would frustrate you, all of these things, those by themselves don't make something a moral fact. Obviously, there's something else, but the idea is that all moral facts are going to presuppose a domain of ordinary empirical facts. And that domain of ordinary empirical facts constrains what can be a moral fact and what the moral facts will be, what moral propositions can truly be said to be right, and which moral propositions can truly be said to be wrong. So sort of think of these as moral recommendations. A moral proposition or a moral claim is a kind of recommendation on how people ought to conduct themselves, right? But the things that inform the judgment, be it true or false, that something is right or wrong, is entirely constrained by ordinary empirical facts. So there's no one is suggesting that ordinary empirical facts are moral facts, only that moral facts supervene upon and are constituted out of, but not exclusively out of, empirical facts. They cannot be divorced from them.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
If you're going to make the allegation, I just think it's borrowing the word. I would hope we could come up with a better word, because it strikes me as a misuse of what we tend to think of when we think of the word fact.
Bob, can I'd like to. I tried to last time we spoke, tried to sort of nuance the reason that I use the term fact with regards to moral propositions is the idea that it has a truth value. So that something is either, if I propose that I ought not stab you in the stomach with a pencil upon meeting you, of course, as Ozzy pointed out, this is dependent upon real-world facts, but it is something that we then, if I say I shouldn't do this, it's something that is either true or false. It's not. It has this truth.
Just that you don't want to do it. I don't
Casey, I am broadcasting right now. You need to go back downstairs. I love you. I love you too. Good night.
Yeah.
Okay, good night.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that you don't want to do that, and I'm glad that we can agree upon the fact that that would be just a horrible thing to do. But I don't know that I think of it as true or false. I just think it is the way we...
Well, and that's what I think we discussed last week, for the most part, was whether or not you sort of agreed that there is such a thing as moral facts.
I don't agree with that.
I mean, I think what the reason that we use the term moral fact is saying that it has a truth value. You're rejecting that notion, saying that these don't have a truth value.
Behaviors that we all seem to possess this sense that they're just wrong. Yeah, I can agree that there's that, and we can even feel very strongly about that. But is it true? Is it false? I don't think it's false. I don't think it's true. I don't think true or false has anything to do with it, personally.
So you don't think that there are moral propositions that can be mistaken?
Well, I don't know what you mean by mistaken there, other than the fact that, I mean, or if I say, well, I think it's wrong for the government to tax me.
Is that true, though? Is that a true statement, or is that a false statement? Or do you think it's neither it's neither true nor false?
I think it's neither true nor false.
Okay, so
me, and I can cope and deal with that as much as I like, and I can make my argument and try and be compelling. But how
are you going to be compelling if it's not true? If it isn't the case, in no sense of it is the case, of that expression, it is the case. If it, in no sense of it is the case, is it the case that it's true that whatever? I'm sorry, what was that proposition about the government?
Taxing him is bad.
Yeah, that taxing you is bad. I mean, why should that warrant any claim on my attention if you say that that the government taxing you is bad?
I don't think
you don't think it's the case.
I don't think it should warrant anything from you at all. I think I just need to make the case of perhaps showing you what the outcome of that would be, and trying to determine if that's an outcome you're also really finding as agreeable to have. And I might be able to persuade you that way, but to try to convince you that taxing me is a thing that in and of itself is wrong, to be honest with you, I think a lot of the international foolishness and evil that goes on because people are dealing with morality in just this very way.
Well, I mean, when you say that something is wrong, okay, what we mean is that the proposition that is being recommended isn't true, right?
That's one way that we use the word wrong. We use it to mean incorrect.
Yeah.
Now, morally, we're talking about, I don't think we're using the word wrong in the exact same way.
Well, don't we mean that the proposition is morally incorrect?
I don't even know what that means. I mean, I can't even conceive of what that really means. I know people talk that way.
Okay, well, I mean, supposing I would say that something outrageous, that you ought to behead your neighbor's children or something like that. You're not, and I said, I recommend this. I think this is the right policy. This is the right thing to do. If I understand your position, you wouldn't say to me, Ozzy, that's a terrible mistake. That's not true. That is not advisable. Right? All you could say is, I am not persuaded of that. But what could possibly persuade you? There's no that proposition by your lights is neither true nor false.
I mean, in the same vein as trying to persuade somebody that a particular flavor of ice cream is superior, I feel that it's basically impossible for me to. I know I used this ice cream example last week, but I'm talking about the persuasive. If there is a truth value to my opinion, right? I believe that this is in fact true, that ice cream is the best flavor in that respect. I mean, I personally hold that, but there's no way for me to compel you to believe that. Anytime that I can say this, you'll say, well, I disagree, and that's kind of the end of it. I can't really make any argument beyond that. How would you go about making a moral argument if it's different than?
I think you're trying to run a foot race using your arms. You're using the wrong tool.
How would you persuade a person? Sorry, thank you. I was muted. How would you persuade a person?
I would
to change their moral opinions. Sorry, go ahead.
Their sense of empathy, their sense of, do you really want to live in a world where people are going to be not only doing this to each other, but where you're also a target of that kind of behavior? You may want to reevaluate just what sort of a world that creates for us, and is that really the place? This has outcomes and consequences, and it's going to lead to other things, and people will react to it in various different ways. And that's is that really something you would value? And in a sense, there's a sense in which you can create that same story much the same way of, if you don't really like the flavor of pickles, then you don't want to have pickle ice cream. If you want a world that is the flavor that it's going to be when you go about doing things like that, and you don't like that, well, I'm sorry. That's part of the package deal. You choose the behavior, you choose the outcomes it leads to, and those are the outcomes it's going to be leading to, given the way that human beings tend to behave. Are you really sure this is something you want? I would appeal to their sense of empathy, their sense of love, but I would not try to appeal to any kind of concept that this is a fact, that it's right or that it's wrong. I would rather people make their decisions more even based upon a gut response of care, concern, love, empathy, than rather evaluating, let's see, under the current conditions, is this something that I can or cannot do? I think people play that fudging game. They learn the rules, they discover ways of exploiting the rules, so long as they're not really breaking them, and then they claim innocence.
There's a couple of things going on there. First of all, no moral realist would deny any of the persuasive techniques that you've invoked. They would all appeal to sort of the actual empirical facts about concern, caring, empathy, altruism, mutualism, reciprocity. You know, all of these sorts of things. We're social animals that have pro-social instincts and pro-social emotions. We also have antisocial instincts and antisocial emotions.
Right.
But so I mean, you can't just rely on people's animal nature. But you're contrasting that with a kind of narrow rule-bound thinking. But I mean, there are other meta-ethical systems, like virtue ethics, which is the system that I would recommend, that it doesn't look to rules, that doesn't evaluate the rightness or wrongness of something in terms of a conformity to a rule. Rules are seen as sort of quick and dirty approximations, in the same way that a dictionary definition doesn't constrain the meaning of a word. It's just sort of a quick and dirty approximation of common usages and nothing more. Definitions are not definitive, paradoxically. And similarly, rules, so-called moral rules, are not definitive of what constitutes right and wrong, that there are other variables here. But everything that you described is in fact how anybody would go around about trying to persuade somebody of something. But that leaves untouched the question of whether or not there is such a thing, whether it's a coherent concept to say that there is a way that you ought to do something, that there is a best course of action, that there are right courses of actions and wrong courses of action. So I mean, supposing you come up against someone and their index of priorities and values is radically different than yours, and so you're unable to persuade them because when you appeal to their intuitions and their instincts and their empathy and whatever, their sense of empathy, the circle of their compassion is not as great as yours. It's smaller than yours. You're not going to be in a position to say, well, it ought to be. You ought to broaden the circle of your compassion. They'll say, no, 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 it's as broad as it needs to be and as I want it to be, given my existing value set and priorities. The circle of my compassion doesn't include people of such and such an ethnicity. To hell with them. We can exploit them all we want. We can enslave them if we wish, right? You're not going to be in a position to say they're making a mistake. They're in error. All you can do is, well, they like the vanilla and I like the chocolate, or vice versa. I think there's a grave danger when we reduce our moral talk to preference talk, which is what it's sounding like, because it sounds like you're.
I think that the only option left after that is war. I think that is exactly why Palestine and Israel are at it, because they want to be able to do more than that, and they can't.
Well, I mean that's sort of an ad baculum argument there, an appeal to consequences. Look what happens when people who are untutored in moral philosophy and don't understand moral realism, look what they might do. They might end up with some kind of naive divine command theory, or they might think that morality consists of a set of a slavish adherence to some doctrine or rules, right? I mean,
they're angry at each other. They have seared their ability to empathize with each other. And I'm afraid that in some ways they're going to have to work this out. And
is it wrong? Is it wrong that they've done that?
Is it wrong that they've done that?
Do you object morally to that?
I do. I object morally to it.
On what basis do you object to it?
I think
you can't say they're incorrect. They're not incorrect.
That's true.
On your view, they're not incorrect. They're not making a mistake.
Well, depending on what you mean by mistake. When we're talking about fact or truth,
they're not doing something they ought not to do.
They are creating a very hostile world.
And is that?
Yeah, they would.
They ought not do.
That. Yeah,
I don't think that their goal is necessarily to create a hostile world. I think that may be the end result, but their goal is to dominate the opposite tribe, if you will. I mean, you're talking about them, not having the compassion for this other group, but I think what it is this dehumanization of the other group. There's the very clear delineation of in-group and out-group, and they're treating the out-group as affording, or entitled to less than their in-group is, and their goal is not to create a more violent, hostile world. The goal is to subdue the out-group and to dominate and to therefore eliminate this annoyance.
Sure,
and is that wrong?
When when the suicide bomber goes over to someplace in Israel, they're going over there under this delusion that this will show them.
Now, it can't be a delusion. They're not mistaken. On your view, it cannot be a delusion. They cannot be an error on this.
Oh, no, I didn't say that. They are deluded in thinking that this is going to show them.
Oh, right. No, okay. So they're deluded about that, but they're not deluded in their action. That is, they're deluded only in that their action's not going to yield the result that they want.
I think that their actions, in some sense, make a lot of sense. They're very angry about being abused terribly. They're just taking a course of action in response to it that is not going to lead to the outcomes they were hoping it will, and they're mistaken about that. And I don't think that they're ever going to change that behavior by saying, that's wrong, that's bad. I think the way they're going to change that behavior is by discovering, do you realize this isn't going to work for you the way you think it's going to?
But on your view, then, what that would mean is that if they were successful in their objective, then you would have no moral objection to it. Your only objection to it now seems to be that their means are inefficacious. But if they were more effective, then you would have no objection.
Well, let me give an example of a possibility here.
Picture how that has never worked in the history of the world, that trying to show somebody something.
But let me give you a hypothetical world in which this might work. Say, for example, there's a person who is sufficiently powerful, or a group who is sufficiently powerful, that any detractors, any objections to the particular system they intend to put into place is met with a bullet. That the immediate result of any dissent is death. Now, in this situation, there would be agreement. I mean, we have to assume a handful of things, and that they'd be capable of knowing that there's this dissent and immediately acting upon it in this manner. But if in a hypothetical situation this were true, say they were able to implant chips in everybody upon birth that would simply explode at the moment that they had a kind of thought that would trigger this, then they would have succeeded incredibly efficiently at enforcing their moral code. Would it be wrong for them to do that?
A lot of dead people.
but that's okay, because they don't have a problem with that. Their goal is, in fact, to only have the people alive who agree with them.
Well, that's a horrible goal, I think. That's my opinion, because I don't think they're going to end up with the kind of people they thought they would have, and I don't think they're going to get that agreement. I don't think it's going to work. I mean, I think the history of the world demonstrates that you can't show people by humiliating them and defeating them. All you can do is subjugate them.
While it may be true that is the case, I think that may simply be an argument that our means are not as effective as they could be.
That's correct.
If we were to develop, say, a means of mind control, or I mean, have you seen The Clockwork Orange?
How about
The Clockwork Orange?
As dignified human beings, and help them to understand, and try to nurture that kind of aspect out of them? I think you're going to get farther than trying to conform people to a way that you think.
I'd argue that, I guess I wouldn't be necessarily making the argument, but I have this book here, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, by B.F. Skinner. Great book. It's, I mean, he came up with some pretty solid methods for getting the behavior that you want, if only you have the means to do it.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying is that we have pretty limited means. Oops, that is not my light down here. As humans, and if only our means were more effective.
Yeah. I do believe that conditioned response is a part of human behavior, and that it is a part of the apparatus of the human brain in acquiring habits and skills. But I think that Skinner way overstepped the boundaries of how human beings use conditioned response to actually become. I mean, he treated them almost like they were, thoughtless machines, and so almost unconscious machines, and I just think it's way too. There is a lot of reality to the conditioned response, and there's a lot of reality to the dynamics Skinner appeals to. But I think he's in denial of a tremendous amount of other things that are also going on inside of human behavior that causes him to rely too much on that particular methodology. I think he's lost.
Well,
I would
I
like to
guess
ask a question.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm curious, Greg. Like, what in your view, what is a moral fact? And I don't mean like an example of a moral fact. I mean, what do you mean by the expression a moral fact, or to say that it is the case that such and such is wrong or right?
And that is a good question because I think that a moral fact is for something to be the case is, well, first of all, it's hard to do it without coming up with an example now. Or without using
You can
examples.
come up with
But
an example if you want. I'm not looking for like a a definition in the sense of a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. I just mean, what is the kind of thing you mean? Like, if you could just sort of describe in your
but
mind what you're talking about when you have in mind the idea of a moral fact, that something's right and wrong.
I mean a normative statement of what ought to be or ought not to be that is justifiably enforceable on a universal scale. Something that we can enforce without hypocrisy and have it be a applicable to ourselves as well as to others.
I would condemn the definition as highly immoral.
Yeah, well, it depends on what you mean by enforceable. If by enforceable you mean that which can be enforced, well, we can enforce any old damn.
Justifiably enforced, I guess what I mean
Yeah,
is that
okay,
it's ethically, it can be consistent.
Enforcing.
Yeah, but that's going to be circular, right? You got to be
True,
careful.
right, ethically justified. What I mean is logically justifiable more. That it can be consistent in that, yeah, I do not violate my or the code in enforcing it. So I guess the only way I can really describe it is in saying that I believe that morality emerges from the complex interaction of moral agents and their environment around them. That the necessary precondition to any sort of moral system is that you believe that there are things that ought not be done to you. And as long as that's the case, as long as you are capable of holding that things are not, there or ought not be done to you, you are to some degree or another involved or a part of this system. Now, if you're a rock or a tree, you don't have this ability. Therefore, there's not anything that can necessarily be immorally done to you. However, it can still be immoral to cut down a tree if that tree is sustaining the life of another person that depends on it, and doing that would be something that person ought not have them done. Basically, it's as long as there's people who can, or not people, entities, there's beings that can hold these propositions of what ought not be done to them. That is a self-evident proposition. Or it's true. I mean, it's a matter of personal taste, right? Everybody can make this statement, and it is absolutely true. I hold that this should not be done to me. And to hold that, there's sort of a necessary precondition that people have a justification behind making these statements, that I have a right to declare what ought not be done to me. And anybody who then understands that they have a right to declare what ought not be done to them, and is capable of empathy and sort of taking on the perspective of those around them and recognizing that these other people have these, or these other entities have these opinions as well, and is now really stepping into the role of moral agency, where they have a deep enough concept of time where they can project out the consequences of their actions before immediate, and not they have the ability to metacognition. So it is complex to really get into all the nuanced details, but basically, as long as I'm aware that you have things that you don't want done to you, and I'm aware that I have things that I don't want done to me, there can be moral facts. It's impossible for there to be a moral fact if I'm alone, and my actions cannot affect any other entities that have this sort of opinion. But the moment two such entities interact directly or indirectly in any sort of foreseeable manner, a moral framework can emerge in which there are things that are true that are dependent on the opinions of both of them, the factual sort of biological cases that are present in that particular situation. But the the truth value of the system is independent of either's opinion of the other.
There's a lot that I would agree with there, but especially with respect to sort of moral agency, and you need sentient beings before you have a moral agent. Although that by itself is not sufficient for moral agency, the being in question has to be a moral agent. To be an object of moral consideration, you don't have to be a moral agent. I mean, my dog is not a moral agent, but my dog is an object of moral consideration because there's something that it's like to be a dog. It can feel, it can suffer, its lot in life can be improved, it can be frustrated.
Right, but a tree cannot, which is
presumably a tree cannot. It doesn't have any conscious mental states. There's nothing that it's like that it feels like to be a tree.
And of course, that is dependent upon our awareness of it. We can make these, and we could be wrong. And in that case, it would in fact be immoral for us to be doing the things that we do to plants, but we can't really be held accountable to that if we're not capable of knowing that at this point. So
yeah. If the blades of grass are screaming in agony when you mow the lawn, then mowing the lawn is a massacre, and we should stop doing it if we ever become apprised of that fact.
Let's not brilliant photography.
Let's not get into that, auras and all that. Let's imagine that. Let's go rather not imagine. Let's go back to that thing you said about rights, though. It seems to me that we're not going to be able to sort of ground any consideration of morality, objective or otherwise, in the concept of rights, because when you talk about rights, I think you're presupposing the concept of right and wrong, right? That is, a right is an entitlement. Right? You are either legitimately entitled to something or you're not. Right? There's either a moral fact about you are entitled to this or you are not entitled to that. And so there's two ways to go. Broadly speaking, there are two ways to go. You can either go with sort of there is a rightness or wrongness to whether or not you're entitled, or it's a matter of convention. These are just conventions that are agreed upon, right? And you can go with some kind of contractualism or conventionalism with respect to the theory of rights. There are the theories of rights, but it seems to me that
let me be more specific with what I mean by that.
Okay.
When I say that there's this they believe that they have the right, it's not necessary that it is true that they have that right doesn't necessarily have to be a true proposition. It is their belief in that proposition that is what creates this for their ability to hold that proposition.
It's a permissive condition. True. It's not sufficient, but it's a permissive condition. Yes. It has to be there before the whole concept of being. Right.
And I believe that's a necessary precondition to even holding opinions about what should not be done to you. If you hold opinions about no, this I don't want you to do that, that sort of it presupposes that you have the ability to make that sort of an assertion.
Right.
And now clarify this for the narcissist and the sociopath have strong opinions, and some of them well articulated about what not ought to be done to them.
Okay.
How would you differentiate that? And of course you can talk about empathy, and I think that it's true that these people don't seem to have a functioning empathy. So that does complicate it, and perhaps really what we're talking about is somebody who's not actually entirely healthy, and therefore.
Well, as long as they hold the opinion, as long as they hold opinions about what ought not to be done to them, they're aware that the things that they are acting upon, the moral objects, are capable of holding such opinions as well, which is why, again, the awareness is significant. If we're the grass example or trees, right? If we're not aware that they hold this sort of opinion, we really can't be held accountable to it. But if they're aware, even if they're not able to empathize and see things from that perspective, it'll make things more difficult for them to be able to predict how things. But if something actually voices this opinion and says, "No, I don't want you to do this to me," well, then they've become perfectly aware of this. I don't think there's any sociopaths out there who are not aware that they're causing distress or doing things.
They're counting on it, I think, in many ways, yeah. But I was just, I'm out on the street and I've got my iPad and I'm photographing a police officer beating the crap out of somebody, and another police officer comes up to me and demands that I move along and starts to arrest me. I don't want him to do that to me. I'm in a tough situation here. What do we do?
Well, this is where we start to get into the specifics of a meta ethic, where or where we're trying to apply it within individual situations that are more and more complex.
Just to clarify a term here, that wouldn't be a meta-ethic. That would be normative ethics. Yeah, meta-ethics are sort of has to do with the criteria by which you evaluate competing moral systems like virtue ethics, deontological theories, consequentialism, or other. That wouldn't be a meta-ethic, but that would be a problem of normative ethics, of the nitty-gritty of
the application of the particular system
among all cultures that represent the meta-ethic.
Well, and here's what I can say is that I believe that given if you have the meta ethic, or sorry, the ethical system sort of nailed down, then there's no situations given enough information about them that you can't determine the moral facts. That if we can presume omniscience on a particular situation, it can be evaluated then for the moral facts if we know all of the details that are relevant to it.
Is there any such thing as omniscience?
No, but we're of course limited by our ability, but that's as I said before.
Moral fact, it sounds to me like we're spinning some castle in the air that is really impractical, unusable, and one of the things I have a real problem with a lot of moral philosophy is that when it comes down to it, any moral philosophy you have that does not operate at the moment you have to act is useless.
No, I would disagree with that. I think that's one of the most that to me is one of the most pernicious misconceptions about moral philosophy and ethics is the view that morality, a moral system, an ethical system, has to provide you with a decision procedure for what is right and what is wrong in any given circumstance. So
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that.
I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. I thought that's where you were going.
If it doesn't have any kind of impact, I mean, for example, a man comes upon somebody who's actually strangling his daughter, and he just mercilessly beats this strangler to a pulp. There are some places where what he did to this strangler was against the law, and where he could be held accountable for it. And that's sad. To me, I think that if we are understanding the natural responses of this father, I don't think that we're talking about somebody who's I think that what he's done may have been extremely overdone, but I don't think that we can. I don't think we're now talking about morality.
Well, I think that any proper moral system would have to take into account natural human reactions, the predictable consequences on other people's actions of your own actions. So if I act in some way that quite predictably is going to elicit a certain kind of reaction that is normal and appropriate, although not necessarily right. It might be the reaction might be extreme, right? I mean, if you come home and you
control of your faculties at the moment to even be able to be aware of what you're doing.
Right, exactly. We understand that there are that one's emotions can be provoked to such an extent that one is operating essentially under a kind of diminished moral capacity, and that should in our legal system more or less reflects this, but our moral intuitions also reflect this, that there are mitigating circumstances, which is why we don't want to say categorically if a person does X, doesn't matter what the circumstances are, doesn't matter who's involved and who's affected, this is always wrong and it's always right. We understand that a moral system has to be more nuanced than that and take into account facts about human nature.
Facts for? Well, I think
that's what Ozzy and I were talking about at the beginning with you, is that the moral facts is basically saying that a moral proposition has a truth value. If we're positing that if you don't take that position, then you don't really have any sort of leg to stand on in criticizing actions on a moral level, other than saying you find it to be morally objectionable.
Yeah, and I would agree with that I don't have a leg to stand on, and I don't want a leg to stand on. And I think that trying to use that leg, if I'm going to stand on it to try and enforce it, that strikes me as being
it has nothing to do with enforcement. It has nothing to do with enforcement. We're talking about whether or not the position that you're advocating is internally coherent. Here's a difficulty as I see it, Bob. If if you look at how moral talk functions, you'll notice that it differs very fundamentally from preference talk. When people are discussing what pizza toppings they want and argue about it, I mean, I happen to like Hawaiian pizza. I like pineapple and ham on my pizza.
You're
Some
actually
people
wrong.
find that revolting, yeah, and some people will say that's just disgusting. Now, people will sometimes joke, exactly as Greg has done, perfect example. Will sometimes joke and go, "Oh, that's wrong. That's so wrong," right? And they will ape. They will invoke a kind of moral talk as a kind of joke, right? And the reason it's a joke is everyone understands that these are mere preferences. That it is in fact not wrong to prefer a certain flavor or topping on your pizza. It's not wrong. It's just a difference in taste and preference, and it's of no moral consequence. But when we take into account certain other kinds of actions, things that people do think are of moral concern, and of course people can be wrong about what is of moral concern. For instance, if the blades of grass are feeling pain, then the circle of our compassion should be broad to include them, the blades of grass, right? But when people are talking about that which they think is of moral concern, the talk is very different.
Yes, it is.
The reason is that when people are talking about morality, they are talking about what in their minds is a domain of fact, not a mere domain of preferences, not the same kind of value. So morality involves values, but a different kind of values than certain kinds of aesthetic values, for instance, like your preference in ice cream flavors or pizza toppings. That is something where we don't get exercise, where we don't think that you should be in the business of recommending a course of action.
My preference for raspberry ice cream is not the same thing as my preference to not suffer.
Right, and presumably your preference for raspberry ice cream is different from your preference for not seeing people exploited or raped or cynically abused or something like that.
I don't know why we need to go to this concept of moral fact to get there.
Oh well, because when you look at how people talk about things that they do think are of moral consequence, they are presupposing a domain of fact. They are presupposing that there is a way things actually ought to be, and a way things actually ought not to be. That's what's being presupposed.
And I agree that a lot of people think that way, but I think that they're living in an illusion, that they have not thought it through, and they don't realize that that just isn't really the case, even though they may think it is.
Why do you think that's an illusion? Is it just because it's hard to demonstrate what is a moral fact? Is it just because that we don't have a decision procedure, a verification procedure for establishing? Because when you were talking about fact before, you were talking about undisputably demonstrable facts, or what I would say is an established fact, and that I think is the mistake in my view.
I know.
We're talking. We differ on what we mean by a fact here. For you, a fact is something that has to be demonstrable.
So where do you think the morals come from?
Where do they come from?
Right.
People's moral opinions, or where the moral truths come from, as I see them.
The whole kit and caboodle. How is it that we as human beings even talk about morals?
Sure.
Why is it this even an issue for us? Where does it come?
Because we're capable of it. I mean,
but why are we capable of it? I think is the question. Like, why are we capable of it?
From an evolutionary perspective, or why would we be capable?
I think you're headed in the right direction there. Yeah.
Well, sure. I'll grant that. I mean, we have this we can look in on an evolutionary sort of perspective and say, well, we're social creatures. We're dependent actually upon our social structure. We cannot survive independent of other. I mean, we're necessarily interdependent creatures. Therefore, the ability to come up with and naturally have moral conceptions is absolutely crucial to us, given what the set of conditions that we had ahead of time. Now, we could also, to be that sort of creature, we could be more like ants, having this sort of drone where you work entirely on instinct, and it would still work. So there's not really a normative aspect or teleological aspect to evolution in that regard. We have this because we have it. But since we have it, then we are capable of examining it and making some,
Right.
drawing some conclusions from that.
Yeah. I would even go further to say that as we even examine children as they go through the process of moral development, we begin to see the kinds of observations they're capable of making, the sense of justice and fairness, of mitigation that actually develops in them. We've even discovered areas of the brain that seem to be involved in that particular development. And so I would, I would want to argue that who and what we are biologically and how it is that we develop involves a myriad of processes involving empathy, considerations, vulnerabilities, and the fact that we are social beings that throws us towards this conundrum of necessity, where we have the apparatus that generates morality as a conundrum, as a decision, as an operation, and then we have to negotiate it among ourselves socially, so that by the time we're done, it's like when I want to measure the area of a rectangle, I need both the height and the width of the rectangle to do it. I can't just do it with one of them. And there's a sense here in which the biology that I am as a person and the sociological context I find myself in causes me to be a person for whom these moral issues are an issue, a problem, and something that needs to be negotiated, and that since it is based upon our common vulnerabilities and our ability to be empathetic, that this puts us in a situation where these now have become viable issues for us to deal with. But does that mean that there's any kind of fact to them? Or that this is just simply the context we find ourselves in as the human beings that we are?
I like your analogy about the area of the rectangle there, because I think that lines up with what you said at the beginning of the show with respect to your understanding of a fact being something that's demonstrable, an established fact, or at least an establishable fact. I'm
just saying that without this biology, you couldn't have the kind of morals you have, and without the social negotiation.
No moral realist would dispute that, though. I mean, that is an observation that cuts in the direction.
Yes, it's just that to me that's sufficient. And when we try to take it farther, I think we actually set ourselves up for
farther than what? Like, I'm puzzled here by something.
We try to make normative statements.
Isn't it good enough that we, as biological creatures, possess this quality called empathy? That we are self-aware of vulnerabilities and the fact that
not
these vulnerabilities. What?
Evidently, it's not sufficient. Because we don't just have pro-social instincts and emotions. We have profoundly antisocial instincts and emotions. I mean, just look at sort of the tribalism and in-group out-group tendencies.
So I guess what I'm saying is, look at the world we live in. Do you think that all of this talk about morality is working for us?
No, it doesn't have to work for us.
We're refined beings.
It doesn't have the concept doesn't have to work for us. The concept just has to characterize an area of discourse, right? There's an area of discourse. We have all kinds of questions. We have questions about, what time does the bus arrive, and what's causing this itch on my elbow, and why does the sun rise and set, and we have all kinds of questions about the world, and we also have questions about what makes people tick, and we also have questions about how we ought to live. What's a good way to live given what our objectives are, and we also have even deeper, more profound questions like, what ought our objectives to be? What should our objectives be? Well, presumably we have other deeper objectives and deeper values, and I would say deeper interests, and I think those interests are objective.
And we need that conversation. We do. We need that conversation.
Right, but I mean, ask yourself, Bob, why are we sort of naturally disposed to say of things like flavors of ice cream, well, live and let live, or when in Rome, do as the Romans, or something like that. We just think of it as no consequence, and we feel no impulse to suggest, hey, you really shouldn't eat chocolate ice cream, or you really shouldn't eat vanilla when there's strawberry present, when strawberry is an available option, right? Why do we never say you shouldn't in those, or you mustn't, or you ought not to, or you have to? Why do we not say that? Why? Evidently, we are able to distinguish between things that we recognize to be mere preferences and other courses of action that we recognize actually are relevant to other people's well-being and our own well-being, and,
That's
and there's a domain of fact that constrains what is
no domain of fact, but I mean that's true. I mean, for example, that's why we don't say don't cause pain on the grass when you cut it, because
yeah,
we
but
have knowledge that that's really part of the deal.
yeah, but if we found out tomorrow that grass was a sentient being and suffered just exquisite torments every time you mowed the lawn, okay, I think we would just suddenly say, we need to stop planting grass seed in our lawns, and need to stop mowing our lawns, and just let it grow to seed. We would broaden the circle of our compassion, because we would recognize that
Right.
the moral fact that it's wrong to inflict needless suffering, right? We would recognize that the proposition, the infliction of moral suffering.
I would not agree with that language at all, and that would not be why I wouldn't do it.
No, but I would want to know why you would not agree with the language.
Because I think that the language sounds to me like stuff people make up after the fact.
Well, people will make stuff up after the fact, but that it has no bear. The fact that people will sort of misuse it, people misuse science all over the place, but we don't say, the science, to hell with that stuff. Okay. We don't do that. That's not how we proceed.
Have you ever done something to somebody that you didn't realize was going to hurt them, and then you see the look on their face when they're hurt?
Yeah, sure. Not so long ago.
I've done it too many times myself. How do you feel?
Horrific.
Yeah, right. Don't you think that? What do I need a moral fact for when I can be aware?
I don't need to know the moral fact. There just needs to be a moral fact. It has nothing to do with you knowing the moral fact.
You don't even need it. That's the point
about something that we don't even exist. You're just talking about something that exists. You can't demonstrate that it exists. I just don't understand it.
You're asking about our dependency upon moral facts to act. And this relies, of course. Why do we need to know the area of a rectangle to step on it? I mean, this is, and furthermore, to use your rectangle example, we have the ability to measure rectangles to a degree of certainty. Of course, any rectangle that exists in the real world, all we can give is an approximation of the area of that rectangle. On a graph, if we give the points on a coordinate plane, we can say the exact area of this rectangle, but that exists only in an imaginary world. It has to be done by
Well, when it comes,
let me finish in saying that with
we have what we call degrees of tolerance. If I tell you that the sound coming from next door is 85 decibels of sound pressure level, obviously my meter is accurate to within blah 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 blah. But if
why is that not sufficient for moral facts, for us to act upon moral facts? Is that if there are indeed moral facts, the way that there are indeed areas of rectangles?
You're saying there are, but you have.
And I believe that there are, and I believe that our ability to assess them is it's limited in the same way that our ability to assess the area of a rectangle.
And it's calibrated, and so.
Hang on a second. Let's consider this, okay? In my backyard, there's a certain number of grains of sand in my backyard, okay? How many, I don't know, and no one's ever going to count them. And even if you set about counting them, the conditions would change during the course of the time it would take to count them, that the count would be confounded, okay? But the point is, in any given instance, there is an integer that would accurately describe the number of grains of sand in my backyard at any given instance, okay? And I'm never going to know that, okay? The fact that I'm never going to know it doesn't mean that there isn't a fact of the matter about how many grains of sand there are, right? That's a completely unusable fact, okay? But it doesn't matter. If something is a fact, it just means it is the case. Now, with respect to moral facts, what the claim is that there is a way that things ought to be, okay? Now, think of it this way. Think of it as an ideal limit, okay? The world is made of all kinds of surfaces, right? Flat surfaces and irregular surfaces. And when I think about a flat plane, okay, I'm thinking basically about things like tables and floors and planks of plywood and stuff like that are flat and relatively featureless. But if I think of a Euclidean flat plane, what I'm doing there is I'm extrapolating. I'm imagining not an actual state of affairs that exists anywhere in reality. I'm extrapolating from flat things that I have seen and experienced, and I'm imagining a kind of limiting case, something that extends in 2 dimensions only, infinitely and is absolutely featureless. It has no third dimension, it has no height, no elevations at all. It's absolutely flat and featureless. Okay, that object doesn't have to exist to serve to actually serve a function. It can serve a function. In fact, it does serve a function in geometry. Similarly, the idea of a moral fact can serve the same kind of function. So I don't think moral facts have to. People don't have to be aware of moral facts for them to actually have a value in a theory of morality.
That there's such a thing as a moral fact, and that they can be functional for them.
Right, but your criteria for exclusion is that we can't demonstrate them. But by your criterion, there is not an integer that describes the number of sand particles in my backyard because there's no procedure.
No, that's not what I'm saying. It may be true that there's no procedure for doing it, but that has to do more with the complication of the problem.
But everything you've described as complicated here has been sort of all the confounding variables and the difficulties and the conflicting interests and values that people bring to bear in life. The situation, I mean, the reason we don't have a science of morality, an established working science of morality, is because it's enormously complicated. Well, we don't have a good working science of psychology for that matter either. But we don't say, well, there's no facts about human psychology and human nature either. We don't give up on this.
Although there are fewer of them than we claim.
There might be. The moral facts might also be very sparse. There might.
I think that you can use the word fact as a metaphor, and that would work. And so I could see it, functioning in a manner similar to and analogous to a fact. But I don't think that there's anybody who actually makes any moral assessments, moral decisions, moral behaviors, or any of that has anything to do with anything other than the cultural influence upon who and what we are as biological creatures who have evolved in the way that we have and developed in the way that we have, so that we possess this apparatus that generates for us concepts of right and wrong and negotiates them socially. And that we're actually capable of, depending on how it's developed and how our culture affects it, we're capable of feeling completely right about a number of things that other people would feel completely wrong about. And there does not appear to be that there is something, it's just kind of like in language. You've got, in English we use the word apple. There's nothing about the sound apple that has to refer to that particular fruit. Nothing. But there is something about the fact that an apple exists, that I can see it, and that I have a linguistic apparatus that wants to find a signifier for it.
Okay, but I mean, there's a confounding variable here with the concept of reference with an apple, and okay, there's the signifier apple or the signifier pomme. They both refer to the signified object, which is the apple. Right. But pomme being the French word for apple. But in the case of morality, everyone understands that you're not referring to an existing state of affairs. Just as when you're talking about a Euclidean plane, everyone knows you're not referring to an existing state of affairs. You are moral facts. No one is suggesting that moral facts are like ordinary empirical facts. Ordinary empirical facts are about existing states of affairs. Everyone understands that a moral fact, the domain of knowledge, is about how things ought to be. And so the question is, given that constraint, is it there in fact a way that things ought to be, and what would constitute something being the right way that things ought to be, or the way things ought not to be? That's where the discussion goes from there.
Let's take another look at this, the way things ought to be. Isn't it true that the state of being is in constant flux? And that we're not even really talking about the way things ought to be. We're talking about the behaviors that contribute to the changing and ongoing change of the state of affairs. And so when we're trying to talk about morality, in some ways we're trying to direct our concepts towards the behaviors that contribute to the ongoing change and flux of the state of what the case is. So to me, I think that we are sufficiently far enough away from the actual dynamic of behavior that I think that I realize people talk this way, and I and
Well,
by the way, I thought that guy that you did on that thump or whatever it was, 63,
Thunk. Yep.
did a great job of describing what is perceived as the difference between moral realism and moral anti-realism, and I think that that's the kind of a conundrum that people have when they're trying to deal with are there or are there not moral facts, and I'm thinking that morality doesn't operate even on that plane.
Well, Bob, I think that it makes it a lot more or a lot simpler if we, instead of refer to things that ought to be, if we refer to things that ought not to be, because I think that we've certainly settled on a fair amount of things that ought not to be: slavery, rape, infanticide, genocide. These are things that, I mean, we have essentially settled that these things ought not be, and we consider these to be moral facts. And
do we?
I know I do.
I don't. I don't. In fact, I think that in our modern
if somebody does institute genocide, again, going back to the if I had sufficient power to murder everybody that dissents, to put a bullet in the brain, in any other way, to take out anybody who disagrees with me, and maybe I can even do it anonymously in such a way that they don't even know it's coming from me. I can claim that this is evidence of my divine authority. I can say that indeed this disagreeing with me is clearly and evidently wrong because it kills you. I don't know why it kills you. I could be lying to you about this. It's very much the fact that I am the one killing you. But as long as I can hide that well enough from the people out there, that they could, in fact, worship me as the second coming of Christ here. I could be the Savior, and this could be the rapture, where I am simply destroying the wicked, and this is Judgment Day. I'm taking people. There's
Let me know how
literally there's literally hundreds of millions or billions of people who look forward to this happening someday. This very situation.
It's very dangerous out there. Yes.
So, I mean, does that make it? This is where the question comes full circle to sort of the thread that started it. Does that make it okay if I am even a deity? If I simply have the ability, if I have sufficient power to make this occur?
That we agree that we are people who struggle with moral questions. We agree that we are people who ask questions about what ought to be. We agree that we are people who share in common a great deal of these values, and that we can give a great number of circumstances and examples where we would all be in agreement. And yet, isn't it interesting? Although the three of us can agree on a great number of examples of what would represent moral and immoral behavior, we don't agree on the way that morality is being spoken about. So, how's that?
Well, my question would be this to you, Bob, and I might ask Greg the same thing. Sort of touching on what you were just talking about, how do you distinguish between something that is a moral problem or a moral question as opposed to just a question of preferences? Or do you think that one reduces to the other? Because I think that's the concern that I have, that your view will lead you to conclude that moral talk is just preference talk.
I believe that people respond to the behavior that is done to them in various ways, and that indeed that some of it is actually quite arbitrary. They nonetheless do respond. I do believe that I would like to behave toward other people in a way that is actually conducive to their well-being and their continued health and their continued dignity. Now, I don't believe that the behaviors that accomplish that are identical for all human beings. And so therefore, although there is this goal, I have that goal not because I think that that's just a moral fact, but because I would like to live in a world where that's the kind of agreement that we have among ourselves. This is how we're going to seek to behave. I think that's going to work for me well. I like that idea. And so I think that it's got a lot to commend it, and so that's why I would go for that. But and so I'm very concerned about the outcome. But I'll tell you what, sometimes I've had this argument with psychologists. They talk about spanking is abuse. Now, I don't think that spanking is the best way to go about it. But I'll tell you what, I've known of children who, when they were spanked, felt as though their parents really cared about them enough to correct them in that way. And I know of other kids, who were spanked and they felt like mom and dad were just, and I've seen different kinds of spankings, where the parents are just out of control and things like this. What I'm saying is that what's more important here is the impact that the behavior has on the person, how they perceive that behavior, and that there's a lot of very arbitrary, non-nailed to the road kind of responses that people can have to that behavior. In Jewish culture, for example, when they argue with you, there's many people who would say that in Jewish families, when they argue with you, it's a compliment because they think of you as somebody, up to the conversation, and if they don't argue with you, it's because they don't think you can really, hold your own. And so there's almost something complimentary in the kind of gruff that can go back and forth. There's been articles about argument is sociability in that particular culture. Other cultures, you argue with people all the time. They feel like, what the hell, why are you always down on me? And the kind of impact that it can have on people who feel that and perceive it in that way is different. And therefore, I think that perception and impact and outcome are so powerfully interrelated to here that it causes us to be looking at a number of things where we really need to see how it's going. I would even argue that when it comes to parenting, parents should not use the style that makes most sense to them. Parents should use the style that is most effective in helping their children to develop, and that could be a different style for each child. And so to me, I do think the outcomes are important, but the methods for which to get there are different. And I don't think it's all conditioned behavior, Greg. It's not that. It's people have responses to the way that you treat them, and some people will be more devastated by the same behavior that other people are encouraged. I know in my own family, when my parents were particularly critical, my sister Barbara tells me that when she was 6 years old, she said to herself, my parents are fucking assholes, and I'm not going to believe a goddamn fucking thing they say. And she grew up and became, when she was 18, she left home, she did this, she did that. She was a highly productive person. I didn't have that reaction. My parents were highly critical, and I thought, I'm just a useless excuse of a human being. And it took me till I was almost 32 before I could even start to begin to feel good about myself, and we both were subjected to the same kind of behavior and had a totally different effect upon us. And so, I think that's a radical thing. So I'm saying that, there are so many variables here and so many different potential outcomes, and they depend upon so many things that are actually arbitrary, perceived, signified in various different ways, that it really causes us to be you got to be on your toes. You got to be aware. You have to realize and try to be sensitive to the kind of impact you're having on other human beings, and realize that.
Wait. Why do you have to be sensitive to the impact it has on other human beings?
If you want to live in a world that's going to be sensitive to you.
If you don't want to.
Yeah. What if you don't want? You just said you have to.
Well, if you don't want that kind of a world, then you don't have to be that way. Fine, do that.
Right. Okay. But no. Hey, this is really everything hinges on this. It seems to me.
Yeah.
What you're saying is that if these are your values, then this is what you ought to do. So as you see it, all moral imperatives are really just hypothetical imperatives. If you want to murder your wife, you should use poison because you're most likely to get away with it that way, or something like that, right? Or if you want to murder your wife, you should make it look like an accident or something like that. Okay, that is what's called a hypothetical imperative, not a moral imperative. If you ask me a question like, hey Ozzy, if I wanted to, murder my wife, how should I go about it? I'd say, oh, well, whatever you do, you got to make it look like an accident. That I'm not actually recommending that you do it.
Well,
I'm just saying, given what your objectives are, right?
Of murdering you?
I'm sorry?
Do you want to live in a world where
obviously not. No, obviously not. But
yeah.
now notice what you're doing here is you're appealing only to shared values. Okay.
Correct.
What that means though is if a person has different values, you literally, on your view, couldn't, not just don't, but couldn't, nobody could have any basis for objecting to what they're saying.
You certainly can't. You can object to it. You can offer your arguments.
You would have no basis for it. If they are acting consistently with their objectives, all you can point out is that their means are not effective to attaining their objectives. But if their means are effective to attaining their objectives, on your view, you have no moral objection. All you can do is say, yeah, I have different objectives.
Correct.
And so I use different means.
Correct.
Right? So you have no objection to what Hitler did, except that you just don't like his objectives.
Well,
you don't think his objectives were wrong.
That's not true. That's not true. That's in fact, that's kind of a caricature of what I'm saying.
Okay, well, I apologize if it is. But I want to hear what you would say to a Hitler or something like that.
For example, I wouldn't expect that we could enforce this upon Hitler or even persuade him.
Enforcement. It has nothing to do with enforcement.
Right.
It has to do with whether or not you have a good argument.
Yes, but I wasn't going there. I was just starting there. We can't do. But also, what we could do is we as a people could agree that we will somehow capture him, take him in, and stop him. And
would that be the right thing to do?
I would encourage us to do that. Sure.
Okay, but so in other words, but he can use the same reasoning, and Hitler did use the same reasoning.
Sure, he could.
If we can round up enough of the Jews and the Poles and the homosexuals and the communists, and if we can just round up enough of these people, we can impose our will, right? It seems to me that when we're talking about right and wrong, we really are talking about how people ought to proceed. It's not just a power game. But on your view, everything reduces to power. I'm sorry?
It's very dangerous stuff. I'm sure that American history would be very different if the American Indian had somehow pushed back on the Europeans and maybe subjugated them or pushed them out.
That's true, but that has no bearing on what ought to be the case. You can point all you want to what happens in the world, and say that if people had if the power relations were different, the outcomes would have been different. But that wouldn't change whether or not a certain course of action that did happen was right or wrong.
Well, and I'm sorry, but things have turned out the way they have, and that's just the way it is.
But there is no moral position that would have a problem with that. Everyone says, yes, look, the world is the way it is. But moral talk is talk about how the world ought to be and how we ought to behave. And so pointing to, oh yes, but look at how things are in the world, and look, things are imperfect and messy.
On that, when we don't have the same values, we have a problem.
Right. So the question is, can a person be wrong in their values, in their moral values? Can they be wrong or not? Can they be mistaken? On your view, there couldn't be a mistake. There's no such thing on your view, Bob, as having the wrong objectives and the wrong values. On your view, there is only your methods of achieving your objectives are not good, or they just aren't mine. That's all you've got. Your only objection to another person's differing values is that either you're not going to be able to achieve your objectives by your means, or I don't like your objectives, they happen not to be mine.
No, I didn't say...
That warrants no claim on anybody's attention.
Hold on, I never said that. I didn't say that you need the methods that achieve your objectives.
No. You actually said that in the course of appealing to a person to persuade them, you would try to persuade them that their means would not be efficacious. But what if their means were efficacious? Well, you would lose that objection. You couldn't argue with them.
To what?
To their
objectives, whatever their objectives are.
Okay, that's not all there is to it. That doesn't make anything efficacious. Just because it may be efficacious to your goals doesn't make it efficacious.
No, efficacious to their goals.
The definition there is that they're achieving what they want to achieve with it.
Bring about your goals.
That strikes me as extremely short-sighted.
I agree it's short-sighted, but it's short-sighted because it can result in people engaging in a kind of narrow means-end calculus.
Right. Yeah. So that's short-sighted. It isn't that short a trip. It's
right. But I want to know what you would bring to bear if you saw somebody who had different objectives than yours, and you thought that they were the wrong objectives. Do you think a person can be wrong in their objectives?
Let's as an example. I have had numerous conversations with Palestinians and Israelis. I'm not going to tell either of them that they're wrong.
Why couldn't you? Why couldn't you?
Now, does that mean that you're simply not going to tell them, or that you don't hold that either of them is wrong?
They're both treating each other very badly, and they're not wrong. In fact, treating them as people who are wrong is a great evil we do to both Israelis and Palestinians, as far as I'm concerned. But I would want to talk to them about. I'm sorry. The truth is, this is an issue that I find very passionate, and I should kind of back off from that a bit. But I would
choose another example if you don't want to confound yourself. Choose another example.
To me, I think it's an excellent example. So let me see if I can just kind of pull my passion back here. I don't talk to them as if what they're doing is wrong. I talk to them as if they are not aware of where this is headed and how this is going to affect them, how this is going to affect their children, how this is going to affect each other, what this is doing to the world, and the fact that this is an insanity in terms of what they think they're going to accomplish with it. Because I don't think this is, you can't find an efficacious way for the Palestinians to prevail. You can't find an efficacious way for the Israelis to prevail. That is an illusion that both of them are already given to, that's creating this perpetuated evil going on over there.
But now notice, Bob, what you're saying is that the way you're going to try to sort of appeal to these people is in terms of the lack of efficacy of their means, that they're not going to achieve their ends, right? But what if they were to achieve their ends that way? What if their ends were achievable and their ends involved the extermination of another group of people? Which would delight them to no end. What if that is their end?
Could build a rock so big he couldn't move it. That's the same kind of a question. It is a ridiculous question.
It's not a ridiculous question. There are people bent on the extermination of other people. There have been entire regimes built on the extermination of other people.
Yes.
We have genocides. So, but on your view, you're.
Should we try to stop them?
Yeah, should we try to stop them?
Ethical justification? I mean, is there such thing as ethical justification?
There is great harm in not stopping them, because I think they're going to have a bigger effect on all of us, not just on themselves.
Is that bad though?
This could be the atomic world war that comes out because of the Middle East and the way that the United States has been meddling in the affairs there, and the things really going on behind the scene, the covert activities.
I mean, on a more general scale, if there's actual genocide going on, should we try to stop it?
What's that again?
I mean, on a more general scale, if there's an actual genocide going on.
But it has nothing to do with whether or not there are any moral facts. That's the thing we're disagreeing on. We're not disagreeing on.
Let us for a moment then presuppose the existence of moral facts only because in the comments on YouTube, and one of my goals with these discussions was to address well, there's something going on in the comments right now about the dependence of moral facts upon a God. So if we do presuppose moral facts, can we at least, I know that we all probably agree on this, so it shouldn't take us much time, but I'd like to address that, or at least state it here on the show before we move back to what we're talking about, that none of this, at least from my perspective, none of this moral realism is in any way dependent upon a deity of any sort, nor would the addition of a deity to a system change anything or even be capable of it. So
I would
some of the comments that are on here.
Can I interrupt you, Greg, just for a moment? Yep. By the way, I do applaud all of you guys because I really don't think that people can tell which one is an atheist and which one is a theist, and I like those kind of conversations, to be honest with you, and I find this to be an extremely useful conversation. There is a gentleman in our chat section. He made the comment. He said, God's character is where oughts come from. There is no other possibility. And then he asked the question, do oughts exist? And your reply to him, Greg, was, William, evidently you side with Bob, the theist, in the conversation. But William Tyndall went on to say, I am also asking how someone can say something is right or wrong without an objective moral law from an objective moral lawgiver. And I think that he's taking that, namely from Ravi Zacharias. He's a Protestant philosopher. And so I would like to get your thoughts on this. If you have an objective moral law, you must have an objective moral lawgiver. Ozzy, can you give your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. First of all, the idea that morality issues from a lawgiver presupposes a legalistic model of morality, right? Where this is taking the idea of right and wrong, should and shouldn't, must and mustn't, ought and ought not. That is construing all of that talk in terms of legalism, in terms of legality. And I think that's completely backwards. I think what we want is a legal instrument, a legal system that mirrors morality. And I think morality is at the heart of law. What we want are laws that reflect the moral order, what the moral facts are. And
again, Bob, for this, we're just presupposing moral facts for the sake of argument.
Yeah. So the idea is that laws are like dictionary definitions. Dictionary definitions don't actually define anything. They are nothing. Dictionary definitions are nothing more than a short sentence, a rough and ready approximation that captures a broad range of uses. And similarly, laws are like rules of thumb. And I think if you have a theory of morality that's predicated on law, you have things exactly backwards. You have the cart before the horse. I think that we don't need a lawgiver, because I don't think morality consists of laws. I don't think that morality consists of rules and obedience to rules. I mean, I practice virtue ethics, and in my view, moral rules, are for people who lack virtues. If you have virtues, the virtues as they're known in virtue ethics, you will have the kind of character which, on average, will result in the kind of pro-social behavior that will make you really quite adorable, quite pleasant to be around, the kind of person that will be courageous and honest and open and trusting and trustworthy, engage in solidarity, who will be patient and honest and prudent, and just there's a whole raft of virtues that lie along each virtue lies along a spectrum of behavior. So, courage, for instance, lies along the spectrum between foolhardiness and cowardice, for instance. I think that when people imagine morality in terms of rule following, they have it exactly backwards. I don't care if a person is being good because they're following a rule. I would much rather know that a person is being good because it issues from their very nature and their very character, that they have cultivated in themselves a kind of character that results in pro-social behavior, such that I know that they will be cooperative. I know that I can trust them, that they will be trusting towards me, and so forth. So I think that there are human characteristics that constitute virtues, that embody the virtues, and that is what I think morality largely consists of. It has nothing to do with rule following, and that's why we value things like discernment and judgment. We like people who understand when you apply a rule and when you ignore a rule. And I think being rule-bound is exactly the wrong way of looking at morality. Now, if there were an omniscient being that understood everything about the world and everything about the sentient beings in it, such a being would be in the best possible position to lay down moral recommendations, to lay down rules of thumb, like the Ten Commandments or whatever you think. Well, I don't think the Ten Commandments are especially good, but some of them are good. But such an omniscient being would be in a position to lay down the best possible recommendations for a course of action. But that being couldn't determine or decide the moral facts. That being could only report on the moral facts and could only come up with rules of thumb that would work in a lot of cases, or perhaps most cases, but not in every case. And
that being would still be subject to them, I'd argue as well, that there's no way in which a being can interact with other beings and not have moral value to its actions.
We'd still have to evaluate the rules and the moral being.
Okay.
Right? We'd have to judge a God anyway by our own life.
Yes. That, by the way,
give a follow-up to this, if I might, because I think there are many theists out there who are, in a sense, hung up on if you have an objective moral law, you must therefore conclude that you have an objective moral lawgiver. And I think that your explanation was excellent, Ozzy. But It sounds like you're saying that we do not have an objective moral law. Is that correct?
I think that there are moral facts. I think there are facts in the world that.
So are you saying that we do have an objective moral fact? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that I think that all facts are objective, or at least intersubjectively available, as close to objective as we can get. These are not mind-independent facts, right? These are facts that are determined by the existence of sentient beings, so they can't be mind-independent, right? So they have to depend on minds. There have to be minds and certain kinds of minds for there to be moral facts in the first place. A universe that was made of non-sentient beings, just a universe of rocks and mindless particles that didn't think and feel, there would be no moral concern. There would be nothing about which anything could be concerned, and nothing for which anything could be concerned.
I would argue even that if there's a single entity within that, there's no such thing.
Yeah, one being alone, I think, it couldn't have obligations, it couldn't have duties, it could have no prohibitions on its actions. So there are no moral laws. A moral law is just going to be a rule of thumb that we come up with, or that some being, even a god, could merely report to us and recommend to us, commend to us a certain course of action or courses of action. But that's it. So morality doesn't consist of laws, and we don't have such laws anyway. We have ordinary laws in the world, and we have moral systems that try to either undergird those laws or try to establish what is the moral order, such that we can then revise our legal system so that it reflects the moral system in question. But so no, I don't believe in moral law because I think thinking of morality in terms of law is exactly backwards. Laws are they're output that come after you have some conception of morality, not the other way around. Morality is not to be understood in terms of law. I think that's exactly backwards.
Let me ask just one other question along these lines, because many times in the conversation with people like Ravi Zacharias, he would ask a question like this: if you have an objective moral fact, when did that come into existence?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Moral facts come into existence when you have sentient beings that can be affected by the actions of other beings, other sentient beings, where those other beings are in a position to deliberate on their courses of action and recognize the predictable consequences of their actions. So once you have a universe where there are things that can think and feel, where there are systems in place, our cells, doesn't matter what they're made of. Maybe life could be made out of silicon instead of carbon or something like that. Or maybe someday we'll be able to program a computer that will be genuinely sentient. Who knows? The point is, once you have sentient beings that can think and feel, once there are systems in place where there's something that it's like to be that system, as opposed to a rock. There's nothing that's like to be a rock. But there's something that's like to be Ozzy. There's something that's like to be Dr. Jones. There's something that's like to be Bob. There's something that's like to be a cat. Who knows if there's something that's like to be an earthworm? Maybe. We don't know. Things get a little gray because we don't have the relevant facts. But once you have sentient beings where there's something that it's like to be those things, you have objects of moral concern. But then the question of morality really only arises when you have beings that not only be the object of moral concern, but can have moral concerns by virtue of the fact that they are able to envision different possible courses of action for themselves and evaluate those courses of actions in terms of the effects of their actions, the predictable effects of their actions on other sentient beings and on themselves. Only then does morality arise. In other words, there were no moral facts before there were creatures with brains relevantly like our own. When the world consisted of things that had no greater intellect than an insect, there were no moral facts. There was no way that things ought to be. But at some point, there were creatures that could entertain possible courses of actions and could evaluate those courses of actions based on the predictable consequences that those actions would have on other sentient beings that can think and feel, including themselves. And on that day, the moral facts came into existence because the moral facts are constituted out of that. And so there was a time when there were no moral facts, and now there are moral facts, and there are facts in the world that determine the possibility of moral facts.
Were any of these authored? Were any of these objective moral facts authored by these beings that you speak of,
No, I don't think that. No,
or just the result of?
they're just the result of. And in fact, if we were constituted completely differently, okay, if we couldn't feel pain, if we couldn't feel frustrated, if we couldn't die, if nothing I did could affect or harm another being, could neither improve its state or immiserate it in any way, then there would be no moral facts. But we are the creatures that we are. We are finite creatures. We are mortal creatures. We can suffer. We can have different kinds of subjective mental experiences. We can be immiserated, or we can be pleased. We can be frustrated, or we can be satisfied. We are social animals. We are the way that we are, and as a result of that, that determines what the moral facts are and can be. So we don't just decide what the moral facts are. The moral facts are decided by the kinds of critters that we are and the kind of world that we inhabit. Were we all like the superhero Wolverine, the moral facts would be different. And if we lived in a world where we were all immortal and couldn't be hurt and couldn't suffer, nor could we do anything to please one another, in a world where nothing we did affected other beings, the mental states of other beings, there would be no moral facts. There could be nothing right or wrong. We wouldn't even care. And this is an interesting thing. Any meta-ethical theory has to be able to answer the question, why do we give a damn about the concept of right and wrong? Why do we even have the concept of right and wrong? Why does it issue forth? It issues forth because of the kinds of critters that we are and the kind of world that we live in, and the fact that there's something that it's like to be us, and that our action, and that we can deliberate between courses of actions, and we recognize that our courses of actions have predictable consequences on the other sentient beings in the world, including ourselves.
What areas in this conversation have you actually agreed with Bob? That is, in the premise of his position in that morality isn't really a fact-based model.
Well, I would agree with Bob that there's a disanalogy between talk of moral facts and talk of conventional facts. As I said, moral facts are facts about how things ought to be, not about how things are. And so consequently, Bob is very right. When people talk about moral facts, they have a tendency to talk about moral facts as if they're talking about ordinary facts in the world and that things are settled. And and consequently, they adopt a very dogmatic vocabulary. When people talk about moral facts, there's an elision, a kind of a gliding from one concept of fact to another, the concept of the way things ought to be to the way things are, and all the way eliding into the concept of established fact. And a lot of times when people talk about moral facts, they're just playing quick and dirty with the concept of established fact. And next thing you know, you've got a person going around talking about moral facts who's talking and acting as if these are established facts that we have in hand, and there's something wrong with you if you don't agree, and consequently I don't have to put up with your disagreement, and I can impose my will on you. And all of the dangers that Bob points to are very real dangers. They actually happen, and so we have to be careful when we talk about moral facts, that we aren't playing quick and dirty with these different senses of facticity. And I think Bob is right to be worried about talk of moral facts, because unless you sort of do a little bit of reading on this, on the concept of moral realism, you're going to end up in a situation where people are just, it leaves them inclined towards narrow-mindedness, dogmatism, and a tendency to impose their will on other people on the basis that they think that they have the truth in their back pocket. And we certainly don't when it comes to morality.
I'd like to get back to Bob in just a moment, because I think that you had something to add concerning the objective moral lawgiver and possibly the objective moral law. But I wanted to ask Greg a question just before we go there. Do you believe, Greg, that God gave Moses 10 commandments?
I believe it depends on what you mean by believe. Do I believe that is part of the story, or that's part of history? I mean, I believe it's certainly part of the story. But as a matter of fact, I think it may be true that God gave Moses 30 commandments, but we don't know, but we're pretty confident that at least 2 of the sets weren't the same. But
yeah. Part about goat milk.
Right, that one, I like that one. But no, I do not believe that is a historical event. As a matter of fact, I'm not even convinced that there was a historical Moses or a historical exodus of any sort out of Egypt. So that I think may very much.
You're probably right. You're probably right. Bob, I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm trying to field some of these questions, some of these comments, trying to get more of this mindset, namely from the Catholic and Protestant model of morality. And so could you speak to that, please?
It's kind of hard to when I don't agree with it, which is,
oh, by the way, let me interrupt you one more time. The same gentleman, William Tyndall, and please understand, I say this out of respect, but I just wanted to make this comment. He said there's nothing worse than a theist with a subjective God or an atheist who is a moral zealot. And so that's why I wanted Ozzy to answer some of these questions, because, it's amazing to have atheists on the program who are arguing for morality and the fashion that they are. It's wonderful to hear discussions like this. And so go for it, Bob.
Yeah, I certainly. The truth is that as Ozzy had talked about what he would agree with me, I think that the difference that I have with Ozzy is a semantic one. And perhaps that's the danger, because the truth is, other than the fact that when he gets down to using the word moral fact, I agree with absolutely everything I hear him say, and I find it delightful and adorable. No, really. And I would agree with it, and I think that even what he said about the conditions that create the fact that we do possess a morality as a facet of our humanity, I think he's spot on. And I also thought it was rather interesting that the argument that Ozzy offered is almost identical to the argument that Charles Finney, who was not always a nice guy, will also agree with, and he upset a ton of people when he was a preacher about 150 years ago in the New York State area. Very influential, created great what were called revivals. Numerous people were converted under his ministry. But he argued that God has no right to be a moral governor until he can demonstrate that he possesses the qualifications and the knowledge and the this and he went through almost the exact same kind of argument that Ozzy went through. And of course then Finney, of course, agrees that this being does exist and that this is why we that this is the foundation of our moral obligation and blah blah blah. So I thought that was rather interesting.
Yeah, it sounded like you guys were on the same page most of the time, and yeah. I was going to jump in because it needs to be stated that Ozzy was using a form critical approach, whereas you were using more of a pragmatic approach toward this topic. Yeah. And so, yes, there was a semantic issue there, and so hopefully people can, rerun or replay this video and get what I'm stating. Go ahead.
Yes, yeah, and I think, I would also think that it's probable that in terms of most moral conundrums and values that we would strike, I'm pretty sure the three of us here would no doubt agree about a great deal of it as being that which is obligatory upon us given the kind of condition and situation that we're in. We just would perhaps talk about the dynamics that make it so a little differently. But when it comes to the practical applications of how we actually how should we then go about it? I think we're all pretty much on a very similar page, with perhaps the only difference being that I don't think it does any good to declare to somebody else that they're wrong. Even if you believe they're wrong, people tend to push back on that, and it doesn't go over so well. I wouldn't do that only because I find it to be a counterproductive tactic, and not because I wouldn't be of that opinion, and not because I don't think that they'd be better off with that opinion. But anyway, I enjoyed this discussion. I thought there were a lot of great things came out, and I enjoyed even a number of the things we had to say. Bottom line, to me, the only problem is that going back to what we see as this foundation of moral fact, I would see it as something that's more of a combination of developmental biology and sociology of what we're going through, and that this is a conundrum we find ourselves in. We find ourselves struggling with it and negotiating it, and we're here. We're definitely beings who deal with these issues and struggle with these issues and seek to somehow come to an agreement with each other about them as well, so that we can create, for what appears to each of us as we contribute to that conversation, a far better world, a far better place, a more loving place. And I also agree with Ozzy that if you need a law to behave, you're lacking in real morality. You don't need a law that to me, even the concept of empathy and love and a responsible recognition that I can't just feel love, as it were, or feel like I'm being responsible. I have to be really sensitive to and conscious of the way other people experience my behavior as a part of what I am involving in how I choose to behave, and what I would want to urge others to do. But I really enjoyed the conversation. I think just great things all the way around.
It's been really, really good. We're out of time, but I want to ask this question, and I would like Ozzy to field it first. Why is the discussion of objective morality important?
Oh, that's a really good one. It's important because the way a lot of people understand the word subjective, they construe the word subjective in a way that is prejudicial and derogatory. Subjective in this context it usually means that it's just biased, that it's just a matter of people applying their own interests. So if morality isn't objective, if there isn't a way, if there isn't an actual way that things ought to be and ought not to be, if morality consists merely of people's subjective assessments and nothing, there's no greater fact of the matter than what people want and how they want to achieve their ends. If morality just reduces to a set of preferences, then there is a real problem. Then the problem is we're left to might makes right. It's just a matter of competing interests in the world, and there's literally nobody who's right or nobody who's wrong on anything. There's just, you either have the might to impose your will, or you don't. You can either get people on your side to convince people by appealing to their interests that you have shared interests, and those people's interests over there are different from ours, and so we need to band together to achieve our interests and foil them in their interests, because if their interests were satisfied, they would foil our interests. There's a real problem there, and to me, it's important that people on sort of the atheistic side of the fence understand the stakes here. You don't want to divest yourself of any moral force. You don't want to divest yourself of the ability to say that, no, that's actually wrong, by saying that morality consists of nothing more than your subjective preferences. Because when you do that, what you're saying to the other person is, what I'm saying warrants no claim on your attention unless you happen to share my values already. If you don't share my values, too bad. Because all I'll be able to do is try to appeal to other values, perhaps deeper values that you have in common with me. But if at bottom our values are fundamentally different, then we're completely screwed. We're going to be at loggerheads. And then there's no reason for you to listen to what I say, because if morality consists ultimately of just your values versus my values, and our values differ, I literally have no argument against your position, and vice versa. So this has the effect of people fleeing, I think, needlessly into nihilism and relativism, and there's a real danger there. You rob yourself of pun intended, of any moral force in an argument when you do that. And people have a tendency to flee the idea of moral objectivity for all the wrong reasons. They will point to the fact that people disagree, that moral opinions have evolved and changed over time. Well, you know what? People disagree about scientific facts. People have disagreed about the shape of the Earth over the course of millennia. We do not, on the basis of the fact that people disagree or that the facts are hard to establish sometimes perhaps even impossible to establish, like the number of grains of sand in my backyard, we don't on that basis decide that there's no there, that there's no fact of the matter. One can make an argument for moral nihilism or moral relativism, but that argument cannot be made on the basis of the fact that people disagree or that it's hard to arrive at what the facts are, and that we don't have a decision procedure or a verification procedure. We do not establish that there are no facts simply because we lack a verification procedure. That's just a non sequitur. And so I think people, especially on the atheistic side of the fence, have a tendency to flee the idea of moral objectivity due to a commitment to a kind of naive verification theory and a naive confirmation theory. And they end up fleeing into moral relativism and nihilism, and then they end up in a position where they really have no argument for what they think is right and wrong. All they can say is, these are the things that I value, this is what I like chocolate, you like vanilla. And that, I think, leaves us at a horrible impasse where might makes right. And I think that the argument can actually go a lot deeper than that.
I can't say anything but wow, that was excellent. Greg, I want you to improve on that.
I get a chance after Greg to respond to that.
Certainly. Greg, I would like for you to improve on Ozzy's last comment.
Yeah, I'd like to say that there comes a point when we analyze this and we say, well, even if that's true, that we don't have a leg to stand on, that we can't criticize any other position, that doesn't actually demonstrate that morality is real. It ends up being a bit of an argument from the consequences, saying that, well, if we don't have moral realism, then we do have this moral relativism. So I think the reason that we end up discussing this in the context that we do, and I know the reason that I focused on it, and I believe probably the reason that Ozzy focused on it as well with Bob, is because of the untenability of the position while simultaneously sort of holding moral opinions, that it becomes internally inconsistent. And it's that's at least my assessment and Ozzy's assessment as we're laying upon our in criticism of Bob. So that I just wanted to respond. There have been some questions about that. That does not in itself demonstrate that morality is in fact real. This, I guess, has been just a discussion of the differences between it. I certainly argue that morality is real. And I think what Ozzy was saying earlier about the of an empty universe and when morality appears, all of those things, if we go back to his sort of sequence of events, are necessary precondition for morality to exist. I'd actually go even one step further, as I did before, but instead of rehashing all of that, I just wanted to say that, yes, it is in fact true that moral anti-realism is not disproven by the fact that we don't really have a leg to stand on if it is the case. But it is something to consider if you're going to take a moral anti-realist position and make any sort of argument aside from, well, I'm strong enough to do what I want. So that, I guess, is all I can really say to close out. Aside from, I was really hoping that we'd spend a touch more time. I know we started sort of focusing on the existence of moral facts pretty early and continued chewing on that through mostly the remainder of the show, but I was really hoping to address more of the objective versus subjective morality and the idea that a God is necessary or even related to the issue. I have always taken the position that a God cannot be the source or grounding of morality. That would be, for morality to have any sort of real meaning beyond just whatever God is or does or wants. I find that to be a non-compelling moral position, and I'd like to at some point come back to that. But otherwise, this has been a great conversation. I've enjoyed it a lot. I really enjoyed having Ozzy here to articulate the things I try to articulate in a much more eloquent manner. So, aside from that, I just want to say thank you. It's good to be back on. I don't get a chance to do this as often as possible, or as often as I used to, and I look forward to doing it again in the future. So, Bob, take her away.
I got to tell you, I agree with you that Ozzy. The one thing I love about Ozzy is he can express an opinion in an extremely clear manner, and in a way that I'm telling you, if you're going to disagree with him, you had better have your act together, because he is a clear thinker, and his arguments are not just something that comes just off the cuff. He's well read, he's well thought out, he's familiar with a great number of possibilities and objections, and he's incorporated this into his. So I love that. However, it might surprise both of you for you to hear me say that I reject objective morality. I also reject subjective morality. I think they're both wrong. I don't believe in absolute or relative morality, and I find the arguments for moral realism and the arguments for moral anti-realism, I find them both failing. Because I believe that our morality is a synthesis indivisible of the two, in a manner where it's not possible for us to even be able to understand what is what, and as a result, we're really left with the with no force in the matter, but that being the biological creatures we are, it is a fact that we are moral beings. And it is a fact that we have a moral apparatus and a sensitivity, and it is a fact that we have to develop this process, but that this process is so also bombarded and shaped by various different subjective contributions that it just leaves us in a manner that I believe even those subjective contributions are a very real part of the ending morality, without which the morality would be different. So I see this more as a synthesis of the generative combination between the way the human organism develops a sense of what it is, and the way that it finds itself in the context of society and other beings. I like the fact that Ozzy talks about that there are objects of moral concern that like dogs and cats. This is so very true. And also, I would have to say this, that this isn't just a matter of subjective differences of preferences. We are the human beings that we are, and I don't believe that it's even humanly possible for us to be fundamentally different in our values fundamentally. I think that we can culturally be shaped in different ways, but so long as we are human beings, there will be certain things that are organismically fundamental to the kind of empathy and concern and vulnerability that we share, in a way that we will always find certain fundamental commonality to talk about, and therefore it's not as if, well, you think this and I think that. I think that that's that may be a logical possibility when we're looking at, but I don't think it's a realistic possibility. Just as, although I don't know what the grains of sand are out there in terms of number, there is a number that does match them. In the same way, there is something about our being the human beings that we are that gives to a certain degree of common ground, but I do believe that common ground can actually be developed in ways that go differently for different people, allowing for that morality to be contextually very different for different people, right down to the bottom in a sense, but it's not going to be that widely varied. So I don't see it as a bigger problem. And I do think that as a result, I find that many of the things both would say, the realism and the anti-realism, I'd find that I like a lot of the things they say. I think that they're creating a false conundrum between them, The last thing I'd say is I think a lot of this comes from the fact that for the long time we've thought of human beings and the way they think as if it's something that is separate from the particular operations of the brain that allow us to think in the way that we do. And I think that the way that our brain operates and thinks does constrain to a certain degree that we don't even understand or realize the kinds of thoughts we're capable of even having without there being certain explanations for things being wrong or ill or having gone wrong or developmentally been harmed. But other than that, this has been a great discussion. I've enjoyed both Greg and Ozzy, and we've covered this very well, and I just really am glad to be a part of it and to be able to just have a voice in it.
Well, if you guys don't have anything else to say, I'm going to ask Greg Brahe to close in prayer, please.
You know, every time you ask this and every time I think, oh, I'm going to prepare one so that I'm ready next time, and then I don't. Let's see. Today I'm going to pray to my daughter to sleep well. My wife also to sleep well, and maybe kids that I'm responsible for tomorrow to sleep in. I think that's my prayer. If they could hear me and listen, I'd be really happy about that.
Amen.
Well, one of the things is the approach that is taken at NCG is one of looking at others as if they have value.
As you can tell, we're committed to a process, not a conclusion. We're looking at bass boats here in Pensacola, having a wonderful time. We would love for you to join us because we want people to have reasonable expectations, not these, crazy, off-the-wall, overreaching ideas that we have to do in the name of faith. Faith is a good thing to have at times, but perhaps it gets a bit crazy, does it not? And so join us each and every week at the place. We're having fun. Now, someone argued that's not a bass boat, but for Jesus it might be.